speak out because I was not a Jew. Then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak for me. Reverend Barber.
Good morning. Good morning. Forward together. That's right. Gracious God, let me thank you this morning for rising, for safe passage and journey, and for all of these, your creation, who are concerned about your children. Help us and hold us, keep us, and use us.
Yes, God.
Amen.
Amen.
It's good to be here with you this morning. And let me thank you for this tremendous gathering now. The Network for Public Education, the board, all of the persons involved, Diane, the president, and Brother Cody, the vice president. Let's give it up for Sister Wood, I'm church boy, Sister Wood, Cody. My kind of sister, she got a boots on, she ready to mom. I asked her, I said, have you been behaving? She said, no. I said, I like that. And then Yvonne, we just love Yvonne. We thank God for her. Let's give it up for Yvonne, my sister. I'm so glad to be here this morning. Don't worry about some things y'all heard. Everything's all right. I know y'all saw a little report. But some people get a little bothered sometimes and say things they don't need to be saying. But we're here this morning. I heard what she said about this orator thing. I want to tell you how I feel when I come to a conference like this. There was a man who had a mule, and he entered his mule into the Kentucky Derby. It was a swayback mule at that. How many of y'all from the country and will still own it? We are in North Carolina, right? And somebody saw that mule and said, man, why would you pay the fee, the thousands of dollars, to put that swayback mule into the Kentucky Derby? He's not going to win. He probably will not even leave the gate. He said, I know that, but I thought the exposure might do him some good. So we forgetting all that orators, that y'all just think the exposure might do me some good. There is, as a preacher, I root often my talks in the theology and the framework of Scripture. In Isaiah chapter 1, there is this scripture that says, learn to do good, work for justice,
Yes.
help the down and out, stand up for the homeless, and go to bat for the defenseless.
Yes.
It's in the Message Bible. And it is, if you will, what true faith and religion calls us to. Not some just personal thing where we look down on other people. But any claim to faith, any claim to deep morality has to begin with learning to do good,
Yes.
working for justice, helping the down and out, standing up for the homeless, and going back to bat for the children. So, from that text, and I see another friend of mine out there say, hey, Doc, when I see another text where Jesus in the New Testament said, suffer, bring the little children. He said it would be better to tie a cement brick around your neck and have somebody throw you in the Cape Fear River than to offend one of the little ones. From those two framings, for a little moment this morning, I want to talk about if we learn, the children will learn.
Yes.
I'm convinced the problem is not the children. The problem is Will we learn as a state? Will we learn as a county? Will we learn as a country to do good? Way back in 1785, John Adams tried to teach us. And John Adams said the whole people must take upon themselves the education of the whole people and be willing, listen, to bear the expenses of it. It's 1785. There should not be a district of 1 square mile without a school in it and not funded by a charitable individual, but maintained at public expense for the people. That's 1785. In the 1800s, when our country took in more immigrants and became more diverse, the education reformers of the 1800s, the 19th century, saw public education as a means of creating productive citizens, ending poverty and crime, and a means of unifying an increasingly diverse population. Now, I learned the importance of education from my mother and my father. I was born August 30th, 1963, 2 days after the March on Washington, and the anniversary date, the 8th anniversary date of the death of Emmett Till. Emmett Till was killed August 28, 1955, partly in response to the Brown decision. My parents said that I decided, since some of you all were marching on the 28th, to hold up. My mother was scheduled to go into labor. In fact, she did partially on the 28th. Me being the kind of fella I am, said, wait a minute, let's see what happens. We had the march, and I was born on the 30th. 15 days later, 4 little girls were blown up in a church in Birmingham where I just visited a month ago. I visited the basement where those 4 little girls were blown up in Birmingham. My parents made a decision. They were in Indianapolis, Indiana. My daddy got a call from E.V. Wilkins in Washington County, North Carolina. Because in 1963, 64, 65, 66, 67, 68, 69, the public schools in North Carolina were still not desegregated, for the most part. For the most part, many schools in this districts in this state didn't desegregate until the 70 and 71 with the Swan case. So here we were 14 years after Brown, 15 years after Brown, 16 years after Brown, 17 years after Brown, and we had not honored what the Supreme Court said. E.V. Wilkins said to my father, will you come back home? Because he had participated in desegregation in Indiana. And my mother and my father made a decision to come back to North Carolina, knowing that they would have to enter their only son into segregated schools. That's how much they loved education, not just for themselves, but for other children. They entered me. I went to segregated kindergarten and first grade. This is not ancient history. Because my mother and my father made a decision that they wanted to be a part of ensuring openness to public education for all children. My mother, who still goes to work every morning at 6:30, she's 83 years old. She goes to work at Plymouth High School, the school she integrated, because they said a black woman would never be the primary office manager at Plymouth High School. I asked her sometime, why did you still go to school? She said, well, they didn't want me to come when I came. Now I'm going to stay till I feel like leaving. She's been there through all the transitions since 1971 or so. My father's deceased now, but he was among the first science teachers. He taught general science and physics. Back when he first went into the school system, sometimes the white kids would say they weren't going to go to his class. And so when they didn't come, he would give them a half a zero. And the parents would say, what do you mean give my child a half a zero? He said, well, do you want them to get the other half? They need to come on to class. He was a part, a lot of people don't know this history, of white and black teachers who would travel clandestine to Elizabeth City State University. And on that college campus in secret, these white and black teachers got together to prepare for the eventual desegregation of schools. So for me, public education is not just about policy, it's personal.
Yes.
When you attack teachers, it's personal. When you undermine funding for schools, to me, it's personal.
Yeah. Right.
And when I think about this history, think about John Adams, think about what happened in the 1800s, think about my parents, I'm troubled by the current political climate in far too many places.
Come on now.
Where people are downright hostile to public education. And teachers are viewed as underperforming, and administrators as overpaid, and school boards as overly contentious and dysfunctional. Now that's true, and somebody said in some places, but this disdain for public education is troubling.
Yes, it is.
Political scientist Benjamin Barber has argued, this is something we must learn. We must learn, if our children are going to learn, that our public schools don't merely serve the public, but they actually create the public. Public schools are not merely schools for the public, but schools of publicness, institutions where we learn what it means to be a public. And we start down the road toward a common national and civic identity. And as a nation, as a state, we need to remind ourselves of the value of public education. The Center on Educational Policy has developed this publication called Why We Still Need Public Schools, and it covers the history of public education and explains how public schools are linked to the common good. You can't have a constitution that says the primary purpose of this nation is to establish justice and to provide for the common defense and promote the general welfare and to ensure domestic tranquility without having strong public schools. In fact, it cites the missions that our country has often expected public education to fill. Schools are there to provide universal access to free education, guarantee equal opportunities for all children, unify a diverse population, prepare people for citizenship in a democratic society, prepare people to become economically self-sufficient, or I would say community sufficient, and then number 3, to improve social condition. These are noble goals. But then the question is, if that's the goal of public education, John Adams was talking about it in 1785. If people were talking about it in the 1800s in these terms, what hinders our commitment to public education? And I think there's some things we have to learn, and we have to have some grown-up conversations about it. One of those things, if we're going to deal with public education, we have to learn and be willing to be quite frank about how racism always gets in the way of us meeting the noble goals of public education. Let me show you what I mean. In North Carolina, for instance, 1868, North Carolina rewrote its constitution and guaranteed public education as a constitutional right for all persons. That's 147 years ago. It was a constitutional requirement. We don't even have that in the federal constitution. Public education guaranteed for all persons. 2 preachers have put it in there. Samuel Ashley, who was a Congregationalist white minister, and J.W. Hood, who became the president of Livingstone College. They were the 2 framers that helped put that language into our Constitution. Samuel Ashley became the first superintendent of public schools. J.W. Hood became the first assistant superintendent. But by 1872, only 4 years after that, people who wanted to go backwards began to attack having a constitutional right to a public education. And what was the basis of the attack? What was the basis of these extremist attacks on public education? Racism. In fact, in this period of time, and sometimes it almost gets confusing, because sometimes I'll be talking about the 19th century and I'll slip up and say in the 21st century, because you see the similarity. In 1872, they began to wail against tax increases because of their hatred of public education for all people. The first cries to cut taxes in this country came in direct relationship to opening up public education to all people regardless of their race. And we have to learn that history and understand that history. And we cannot say when people today want to cut taxes and undercut public education that we haven't seen anything like this before. Yes, we have. It has been the challenge of this democracy. We had a civil rights law in 1875 that made it a felony to discriminate. That law was overturned by 1883. Because of the disdain for education being open to all people. J.W. Hood, I told you, was the first assistant superintendent of public school. Samuel Ashley was the superintendent of public school. Both of them were run out of office. How did they run them out of office? They defunded the department. Did you just hear what I said? This is 1870. They defunded the State Department of Education, wasn't called at the time, but similar, in order to get rid of a superintendent and an assistant superintendent who wanted to educate all children. In fact, if you go back and read the records and ask people like Tim Tyson and others who do this study, the record says that J.W. Hood founded a school in Fayetteville that was the best public school in North Carolina, not the best black public school, but the best public school. It happened to be all black because we had not fully dealt with full integration in the 1800s. But and the people who did not want him there began to say, if we do not get rid of this Negro, he's going to educate every black child in North Carolina. We have to learn this history no matter how ugly it is. Charles B. Aycock, who we often tout and misteach in our schools, that he was the great educational governor. Well, in some ways he was. He did raise taxes to build schools, and he convinced North Carolinians to raise taxes, but how he did it shows us the danger of a racist agenda. He went to white men and said, you better let me raise taxes and build schools, because we're also going to have a literacy test and an educational qualification for voting. And if you don't let me raise taxes on your property in order to build schools, then your white sons will not have any more power and authority than black boys. And that's how he got all the money. So when we see schemes that come up today, when people suggest that if you give us a certain amount of money and vouchers, we're going to educate certain people, it's the same rhetoric. Divide and conquer. Yes. Don't ever forget, in 1954, May 17th, you had the Brown decision. Right. And then, but remember the Brown decision? Charles Koch's daddy, Freddie Koch, the leader of the John Birch Society, called for the impeachment of Earl Warren upon the decision of the Supreme Court in Brown. And he even called for the impeachment of Dwight Eisenhower, a Republican, when Dwight Eisenhower said that funding public education was a matter of national security. If we're going to deal with the challenge of public education today and where all of this disdain for public education is coming from, we must learn this history and know what we're dealing with. It was I, Beverly Lake, from the state of North Carolina, that joined a group of lawyers in 1955 that went back to the Supreme Court for Brown II. And we don't talk about this part. They went back and ensured the addition of a clause with all deliberate speed. Yes. You can't be deliberate and speedy.
Come on.
In essence, they said the court could be right to overturn Plessy, but the courts could not force the states on a timetable.
That's right.
That's what allowed North Carolina to hold off for another 17 years. One of the main lawyers that helped put that into place was I, Beverly Lake. You can't understand some of the stuff. Vouchers isn't new. Go back and understand the Pearsall plan. Right after Brown, when they came up with the Pearsall plan, and they said basically, if you don't want to go to an integrated school, you can take public money and fund private schools. Go back and look at the history of all of these religious schools that were founded right after 54 in the 60s. And how early on they sought to use public money to create private schools. Didn't say against black people, said for religious purposes, but for some folk, racism is a religion.
Yes, it is.
In fact, not only is it a religion, it's a form of idolatry, self-worship.
Oh.
And look at how when we cut money from public schools, we don't just hurt black children, but we hurt all children. But never forget, we got to learn what created white flight. We got to look at the beginnings of racial redistricting. When schools said, okay, we're going to have a unified school system. What we're going to do is we're no longer going to have out-of-district transfers, and we're not going to bus people out of district. And then we get the school board to slowly redistrict the school system by cutting away white communities out of certain areas until you create a donut and you have the black school district as the whole, like in Goldsboro, where now the city of Goldsboro is 100% resegregated in 2016 in a city that's 50-50 black-white and has an Air Force base in the middle of that city. But the Air Force, the kids on the base don't go to Goldsboro High School even though they're closer to Goldsboro High School. Because slowly over time, this redistricting was done in a way to cut out so that I live in the city and my children aren't even allowed to go to school in the city because of where we live. The zones are drawn. Goldsboro High used to be a 4A school that benefited from military impact money. Now that military impact money does not go to the schools in the city, even though the base is in the city. You can't unpack what's going on with public schools unless you look at the history and the continuing reality of race. And then you have to know the Southern strategy that started in 1968, that was first utilized by George Wallace, who became the greatest loser in all time because he taught Richard Nixon how to use the code words of the Southern strategy. And then Ronald Reagan used it. And so one of the code words of the Southern strategy is you don't say the N-word, you say forced busing. And you use that as you use the code word, you use that as a wedge issue. And you began to talk about forced busing at schools in a way that makes many Southern whites vote against their own self-interest. Now, why would you do that? Because if you can lock up the 13 former Confederate states, if you can cause people to vote against their own self-interest, to vote race rather than reality, then what happens is you end up controlling 162 electoral votes out of 13 states, which means you only need 100 electoral votes out of the other 37 states to control the presidency. And you also, if you control those 13 states, you control 31% of the House of Representatives, which means you only need 20% more out of the other 37 states. And if you get that kind of control, you have basically the ability to elect a president and a Congress that's opposed to public education. That's what the solid South is all about. It is the ability to have a Congress and a president and state legislatures that are opposed to public education.
Yes, it is.
Uplift programs for the poor. The fact of the matter is, the statistic says today that out of the 300 poorest counties in this country, most of them are red counties where they have elected people who vote against poor people when most of the poor people are in those counties and most of them are white. What makes people vote against their own self-interest? What trumps common sense? We have to learn that the very purpose of public education gets distorted and fought when racism is not unpacked and named. And so we're going to have a conversation about social justice in public education. You cannot, in this conference or any other conference, find a way around racism. You've got to have a grown-up conversation. Whether you like somebody, I'm not talking about David Duke, I'm not talking about whether somebody puts a robe on. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about systemic planned policies that undermine the ability of us to be a democracy for and of and by all the people. That's what we're talking about. Because the conversation about racism can't just be at a black event, and it can't just be lifted by black people. We need white people and Latinos and Asians to all talk about race and black people. We have to take on some black people who promote policies that are also racist, but they look like you.
Yes! They do it everywhere. Yes!
But there's something else we got to learn. If our children are going to learn, we have to learn that the fight is at the state and the county level. I know we're in a presidential campaign, but don't you let all of this stuff going on with the presidential stuff trip you up. I think some of this stuff may be even planned. I'm telling you, because I'm thinking about, we talking about people's wives and not policy and where they're standing on war. We're talking about tone and not what kind of money you're going to spend and what departments you're going to cut and how that's going to affect. And if you don't have ideas, the best way to not have to talk about your ideas is to create a foolish fight.
Exactly.
We gotta understand, yes, we're in a presidential election, but the fight is at the state level.
Yes, it is.
Those of us who love public education can't be DC focused alone. The attempts to break teachers' unions happen in general assemblies at the state level. Budget cuts happen at the state level. Vouchers get proposed at the state level. How we raise salaries get proposed in governor's mansions and in general assemblies. These are local state decisions. And if we're going to deal with public education, we have to build a movement at the state level. We cannot get mesmerized every 4 years. We have to stay engaged every day of every year.
Yes.
Then thirdly, we got to learn that and teach that public education isn't just about policy. Public education is a human right. It's a civil right. Why? First of all, because my Jewish friends would tell you that when God created everything, he stepped back and looked at it and said, Tov miyad, very good. And that meant everything that was created, men and women and people were created in the imago Dei, the image of God. And anytime you undermine a person's ability to develop, you are attempting to block the full development of the imago Dei. In other words, when you block a child's ability to get education, you're playing God. Public education is a civil right, a human right.
Yes, sir.
And we can't get caught up too in these. One study talks about competitive programs, talking about which schools are better. In this democracy, particularly in this state where we have a constitutional right to public education, the issue is not about winners and losers. All schools are supposed to be great schools for all children. Period. And we can't allow people to look at a school that's resegregated and high poverty and say, well, they still had a valedictorian. Or, well, I know somebody who made it through. I love the analogy my friend, the former dean at the law school at UNC used to tell. He said, you know, I know it because, you know, I used to be a little pool hustler. I thought, you know, and you know how you hustle people pool. Anybody know how to play pool? And don't y'all be so ashamed. And the preacher can admit it. Let me see. None of y'all won't raise your hand, Lord. All right. So, okay. When you hustle pool, the way you do it is you set up a shot. You know, you set up shots and you play tricks, like tilting the table up at the end. Now, somebody can make that shot, but the problem is that's not how you're supposed to play pool. The table is supposed to be level. So when you suggest, well, this kid graduated from this school, sure, it's resegregated, high poverty, sure, we pulled all the teachers, the high quality teachers out of, sure, we did that, but they made it. And everybody else can make it if they just work hard and come from a good family and their parents pray with them. That's hustle. Because the fact of the matter is, they shouldn't have to make the shot with the pool table tilted up. Then next, we have to learn, because it's a civil rights issue, we have to learn to deal with this ugly reality. And that is that schools are resegregating in high poverty today faster than they were in the 1970s. 62 years after Brown. There ought to be a lament about that. There ought to be some tears about that. John Cazole wrote The Shame of the Nation in 2005, and listen to what he said. He says he connects education to power by contrasting the kind of education given generously to children of privilege with schooling that is made available to poor children in segregated schools. He says that he believes that much of today's school reform is an exercise in improving separate schools. That the exercise in simply trying to improve separate schools is no more than giving in to the worldview of Plessy versus Ferguson in the 21st century and justifying separate but equal. Resegregation is serious. It's not just about the resegregation of bodies. It never was. The fight for integration wasn't about that black folks sat beside white people they could learn. It wasn't the point. The point was if you resegregate, you segregate bodies, you segregate budgets.
Yes.
You segregate budgets, you segregate books. You segregate books, you segregate curriculums. You segregate facilities. Resegregation is also connected to residential segregation. That's why when we simply fund schools based on property tax, it's inherently unequal.
Yes, it is.
because then we fund based on wealth and ownership and not the importance of every child. Not only that, we have to begin to talk and learn about the economic value of public education. We have to talk about that. The Economic Policy Institute says that the full potential economic payoff of a major investment in America's children would occur if the achievement gaps were eliminated between American students of different incomes, classes, races, and ethnicities. Or even if we just improved it and closed the gap between the average American student and the students in higher performing national education systems. The studies told us as far back as 2005, it's not that we don't know, the society doesn't know this, the issue is will we learn to follow it. A study in 2009 said that estimated that the closing the achievement gap between low-income students and others would boost the GDP $70 billion. That if you close the gap between the races and ethnicities, it would boost the GDP by $50 billion. And further, a major investment in America's children also boosted the average performance of American students. Payoff will be even larger. It says if you close the gap between the average student and the higher achieving students, it would boost the GDP by $180 billion. And we have to challenge those who said, yeah, but we don't want to spend any money. Wait a minute. Now, yes, you do. You don't mind spending money because you say things like a bank is too big to fail. You don't mind spending money. You don't mind spending money because you take money from the government and give it back to the wealthy. You don't mind spending money when you want to spend money. But the question is, we have to say, you cannot say you love children and then fight investment in their lives, and investment in their teachers, and investment in their school. That is hypocrisy. It is a national moral disgrace. I was talking to my good friend, Mary Wright Ellerman. She talks about this in her report, that there are 14 million poor children, 6.5 million extremely poor children, and there are 8 million more poor whites than there are blacks in this country. Not children, but just citizens. We have the world's largest economy. We got 14 million poor children. And that number exceeds the population of 12 states. In other words, you could add up the population of Alaska, Hawaii, Idaho, Maine, Montana, New Hampshire, North Dakota, Rhode Island, South Dakota, Vermont, West Virginia, and Wyoming. Or the combined population of Sweden and Costa Rica. That's how many poor children we have. And we know from a study of the Mailman School of Public Theology in Public Health at Columbia University that more people die from poverty and the lack of public education every year than die from heart attacks, strokes, and cancer. It's a moral disgrace. And the younger children are the poorer they are during their years of their greatest brain development. We got to learn this is a moral crisis. That's why HB 2 is bad. See, they want us to say it's the bathroom bill. It's really the outhouse bill, because what's in it is what you normally leave in a outhouse. It's a hate bill, sure, but it's a trick. It's nothing but the politics of Jesse Helms resurrected. You remember in '84 when Jesse Helms was 40 points down in the polls? He started talking about gay issues and race issues and combined them because he mixed that poisonous brew. And then he added that to tax cuts. That's called a Southern strategy. And so they got all of us out here talking about bathroom bills. You know, it's bad because it impacts our gay and lesbian brothers and sisters. Yeah, that would be bad enough. You know, especially in a country that says equal protection under the law for everybody. That's bad enough. But this bill is an anti-children bill because Section 2 says that a city or municipality cannot require their contractors to pay a living wage, to get vacation time or sick time, and it cannot require a contractor to have minorities set aside. That means that you can't get living wages. If you can't provide living wages, you can't deal with the issue of child poverty and family poverty. If you don't deal with the issue of family poverty and child poverty, then you undermine the ability of our children to learn. HB 2 is an anti-family bill. It's an anti-children's bill. It's not protecting children, it's hurting children. The majority of the people that would need a living wage are women. It's an anti-women's bill. And we cannot just allow the language to be used that it's a bathroom bill, particularly in the light of poverty. In this state, 1.6 million poor people in this state, 700,000 of them are children. 45% of African American children are poor, and it's not because black folk are immoral and lazy. It's because we had systemic removal of jobs from our economy, because we've had a state where too often Democrats and Republicans have loved low-wage jobs rather than high-paying jobs. And so we have to deal with this issue of poverty. And we know right now, Mary Wright Edelman talks about it, it's a moral issue, because it's not that we don't have the wallet, the issue is we don't have the wheel. Because we just took 2% of our federal budget, we could bring child poverty down among blacks 72%, and overall child poverty down 60%. And we could save nearly $430 billion, because the loss of productivity and the extra health and crime costs for adults that grow up poor adds up, according to this report, to $500 billion, which is 6 times more than the $77 billion that's needed to bring poverty down among black children 72% and poverty down overall 60%. We just took 2% of our national budget. If we just close the loophole and let U.S. corporations avoid taking $90 billion in federal income taxes and shifting profits to subsidiaries and taxpayers, we could invest in our children and go after childhood poverty. And if you go after poverty, then you're also elevating the ability for a child to learn. Because I don't care if that child is black or white. If the parents can't pay the light bill, they're all black in the dark. The child's stomach is hurting, they don't cry black, they don't cry white, they cry hungry. They cry hurt. And so it's a deep moral issue, because the Bible says, where your treasure is, that's where your heart is. Yeah. Where your heart is, you can't talk to me about loving children unless you're willing to invest in them and to address the issue of poverty. So we love America. We love North Carolina. We got to come in this conference, but we've also got to do like many of you, Yvonne, we got to go to court. Sometimes we got to march. Sometimes we got to get arrested. And sometimes we got to, and all the time we got to vote. Because we must say that on our watch, we will not stand for a state that puts less money in public school and children than Mississippi. We will not stand silently for a General Assembly and a governor that continues to whittle away at our future and the future of our children. We must begin to say, not on our watch. Remember, Eisenhower said that funding public education is a matter of national security. And if Eisenhower as a Republican could say it, all of us need to be saying it. Our state and national security is at threat, is being threatened when we do not care for all children and lift all teachers and lift all schools. And so, let me close. Let me tell you why I think one thing you need to do at this conference. Look, Yvonne. Isaiah says, learn to do good. I'll tell you why you're having this conference. How many teachers in here? Yeah, great. How many folk love children in here? Those of you who have come to this conference, you are coming here to learn, because now we need you to take this state to school. Yes. We need you to take every school board to school. We need you to take the governor to school. We need you to take the politicians to school. We need you to take Berger and Moore and every member of the General Assembly to school. We need you to take those Democrats that voted for that bad budget to school. We need you to take those to school that have tried to undermine our voting rights in this state. And we need to take them to school until we learn to do right by every child in this school, in this state. We need to take them to school until every school is lifted and every community is lifted and everybody is blessed. My mom, my daddy is crying from the grave, and so many others. And they're saying if we could fight then, God knows you ought to fight now. Somebody ought to say, wait a minute, we're not going to be scared of a little Tea Party money and a little Coke money. We know some people that came through Jim Crow. We know some people that came through slavery. We know black and white people in the past that came together and changed the South. And if they did it then, we can do it now. We've got to take this state to school. And why must we take this state to school? Because every child is important. And I hear the poet, when the poet says it like this: fleecy locks and dark or black or white complexion cannot alter nature's claim. Skin color may differ, but perfection dwells in black and white just the same. Were I as tall to reach the pole or to grasp the ocean with a span, I must be measured by my soul, for the mind is the standard of the man. You know when I say that, every child that I've ever had, as soon as they're born, I go in the birthing room, I put them in my arm. Sometimes the doctor said, they don't understand what you're saying. I said, it's not about what they understand, it's what we need to understand. As you fight, fleecy locks and dark or white complexion cannot alter nature's claim. Skin color may differ, but perfection dwells in black and white just the same. Were I as tall to reach the pole or to grasp the ocean with a span, I must be measured by my soul, for the mind is the standard of the man. Stand up for our children. Stand up for our children.